done some other work elsewhere. This is from 4 sites in the UK. These are internationally protected sites. These are Ramsar sites. These are the absolute jewels in the crown. There's only 2,000 or so Ramsar sites in the world. This is 4 of them in the UK. I mean, there's loads of them in the UK. There's about 200 of them in the UK, but these are 4. These are protected. Now, coming back to that thing on ecological character, part of their ecological character is the ecosystem services. It's the benefits that they provide to human society. It's not just about the number of water birds or the number of otters or special plants. It's also about the ecosystem services. And I looked at 4 sites in the UK and did exactly the same. Said, are we looking at what I'm calling a recognition gap, where even for the most protected sites, we are undervaluing them? We might not be undervaluing them directly in terms of their biodiversity, but in terms of recognising the services that they're providing. In these 4 internationally important protected sites, these couldn't be any more protected under European legislation than other sites. And still, we are failing to recognise the value. And that really repeated what I was finding from these case studies from cities around the world. So if we fail to recognise them, this really shows that there probably are difficulties in actually recognising them. We need to understand that the difficulties exist. And this leads us to a recognition gap that we need to overcome. And this was supported by other work that I've done and also other work that other people have done elsewhere in the world. Now, this issue that supporting services are really poorly recognised is worrying, because it's this failure to recognise the supporting services means we can't put them into decision-making processes. We can't put them into economic decision-making processes, and it skews our cost-benefit analysis. And this puts more weight on having to go down an ethical route rather than a socio-economic route. And unfortunately, if you go down an ethical route, we know already that despite probably most people in this room feeling contrary to it, biodiversity is a small specialist interest. Most people don't belong to conservation charities. Most people like the idea of it, but they won't actually put their money where their mouth is. By failing to recognise the full breadth of ecosystem services, it does put more emphasis on the need for the ethical. But ultimately, it compromises human well-being, because we are actually degrading, and I come back to Richard's comment, it's not just about loss or fragmentation, it's about degradation. We are degrading habitats as well as losing them and fragmenting them, and that is compromising our own well-being. So we are effectively biting the hand that feeds. So we need to put these within, understand these impacts of fragmentation, of degradation, and of loss, but we need to put it into a socio-ecological system. We can't just talk about it between one and the other. They're not 2 separate systems. There's elements within the ecosystem approach which really speak to this, about how you have to have decisions devolved to the appropriate level of decision making, and that's why I think the whole city regional planning context is really important for this. And so what we need is we need to somehow link ecological processes and ecosystem services back into society to make sure that we're not actually having unintended consequences, that we are actually understanding the impacts of habitat fragmentation, and we maybe are looking at ecological engineering, as we saw this morning. There are ways we can engineer the ecology to actually help deliver and bring society and the ecological processes together. This is just one very quick piece of work. I'm not going into a lot of detail here, but this is some work that was done at a workshop which the Ramsar organised along with the Danone Fund for Nature, which seems like a strange bedfellow. The Danone Fund for Nature, major food producing organisation, wanted to be carbon neutral. So they came to Ramsar as a wetland organisation and said, if we have to invest in habitat restoration, which wetland habitat do we restore to get the most carbon so we can become carbon neutral as a company, and then we can sell our carbon credits to other companies and steal an economic advantage over our competitors. So they convened a workshop, and one of the outputs of the workshop was this, where a whole group of experts sat around and we tried to say, for different wetland types, what are the relative differences in terms of ecosystem services? And we sort of said, for this sort of wetland type, generically, is it 0, 1, 2, or 3? 3, a lot of ecosystem services, 0, none. And what it shows is when people talk about wetlands, and I'm using this as an analogy for all types of habitat, it could equally be forest, it could equally be coasts, is that they all perform differently. We're not talking about homogeneous systems. Again, it's talking to the heterogeneity. And certain wetlands, such as rivers and waterfalls, and tropical non-forested peatlands, tropical peat swamp forests, perform more ecosystem services than others do. It's not saying that these are less important when it comes down to the individual service. It's just trying to understand that different ecosystems behave in different ways. So if we're trying to look at this within a spatial planning context, within a fragmentation context, we can't treat everything as the same. There is inherent heterogeneity that we need to understand, not just in terms of the type of habitats, but equally in terms of the services they provide. So they're not all the same. Different processes are part of different systems. There are spatial, but there's also temporal variation as well, and that's equally in terms of ecosystem service delivery. But one of the things we also need to think about is if ecosystem services are part of a social construct, the beneficiaries of those services will also change, and they will change over time and over space. So people who now live in areas in Europe, in lowland areas which are populated, are depending far more on upland land use because the threat of flooding is much greater, as population centres have expanded, than they would have done maybe 400 years ago, where the landscape would have still been performing the same function, it still would have been holding up water, but the beneficiaries were much less, and that changes, those beneficiaries change over time and space. And also, if we're trying to look at beneficiaries, should we also be looking at equity as sharing? Is it right that you have all the benefits of ecosystem services lying in the hands of only a few people, or should they be spread and distributed more greatly across society? There's also issues to do with both fragmentation and densification, because if we are going to densify in urban areas, what would be the implication for ecosystem services for that? And there's an argument that if you densify, and we looked at earlier on, there's the information about urban heat islands and the cooling effect of green infrastructure within urban areas. Well, one of the key things, if you densify around that, more people benefit from that. You're actually increasing your number of beneficiaries by making a population centre more dense. So if we're looking at it in terms of beneficiaries, maybe there's arguments for densification. And we need to think about how fragmentation really drives processes as well as just the fragmentation per se. So the challenge is, and I haven't got the answers, and I hope over the next couple of days we can thrash out some of the answers. I think we need to move from these concepts into practice. People have been talking about this for the last 20 years, but we really do need someone to pick up the baton and really run with it and say, we can do this. There are ways we can look at this, to look at these difficult issues and look at these different methods and principles. And this is just one set of principles that out there. This came out only recently, and this was looking at wetlands. And it's saying if we're going to do this, we need to define what we're talking about. We need to define the ecosystem services. We need to maybe classify them so we can actually get them on the table to talk about them. We need some sort of objectives and principles. Why are we doing this? We need to put them into a framework, be that a spatial framework or a decision-making framework or a governance framework. And then we need a plan. And so we actually then know how we're going to implement this. And implementation also increases, to reinforce Joachim's point, it also includes monitoring for implementation. So you know you're doing the right thing and you can feed back if you're not. So these are just some of the principles that I think we could consider. We need to be able to recognise, measure, quantify, capture value of ecosystem services. Now, I'll just deviate for a second about green economy. There's a lot of stuff coming out about a green economy. I'm inherently a cynic because people talk about a green economy. If we're not recognising the value of nature and of ecosystem services, how can we have a green economy that's built on something that's not recognising value? I don't understand how a green economy to me has to recognise all those values as part of an economic framework. If we are failing to recognise them, we are compromising or undermining the delivery of a green economy. So we need to have this, and it's got to be, the way you do that is you need to bring people together. You need social scientists, you need economists, you need natural scientists. We need to understand the processes and how they drive things, and how human society actually then takes the benefits through consumptive, non-consumptive uses of ecosystem services. How are we actually doing that? We need to recognise and define them. We need some sort of system that's non-duplicative. And I talked about the whole issue of double counting. Double counting is fine if you're aware of it, but then when you're making decisions, you need to make sure that you're not double counting, and you have ways of dealing with that. So you're not having one benefit measured and valued twice, because then the system falls down. But ultimately, it comes down to individuals. Individuals, we actualise as ecosystem services, whether as an individual within a society, but we are still an individual, we are still stakeholders. And again, speaking to the ecosystem approach, it is about, we need to engage with stakeholders. We need individuals, whatever nature individuals takes, and stakeholders, to be part of the implementation and part of the recognising the benefits. And that's absolutely crucial. If you don't take them with you, then there's a problem. And this has been shown all over the world, where protected sites have been protected for biodiversity interest in terms of charismatic or threatened biodiversity. And then what happens is, because the people weren't taken on board, they are the ones that then degrade that very biodiversity that you're trying to protect, because they've been excluded from the process. So just to sort of, in some of the priorities, we've got to understand that ecosystem services are vital for human well-being. They depend on all forms of biodiversity, and we need to get a bit more cute about the way we think about biodiversity. We've got to understand that ecosystem services are poorly recognised currently, and fragmentation will impact those processes and the habitats, and that will alter the delivery of ecosystem services. It might be positive for some, it might be negative for others. And because we're not recognising them, they're underrepresented in assessments, especially in cost-benefit analysis, where a lot of big decisions are made, and ultimately you reduce human well-being. But I could change that, and I'm going to change one word, and I've changed that to densification. So all I'm doing is changing that, and you're exactly the same. So this doesn't just speak to fragmentation, it speaks to other elements within thinking about the city and region planning. So just for some discussion points, and there could be many more, these are just some things that I threw out late last night when I got back into my hotel room, is it might be that people are already recognising ecosystem services very well, and certain ones are being recognised better than others. It might be that there's good integration out there already, where looking at city region planning, that ecosystem services are being well addressed, and they're being integrated into decision-making frameworks. And I know there are a few good examples around the world. And can we learn from those examples? And can we also learn from the bad examples where unintended consequences have basically degraded ecosystem services, which we're now living with those unintended consequences and having, as we've seen, spending lots of money to rectify problems. And it's a changing and dynamic world. Things aren't static. And time and space, things will change over time and space. We've seen predictions of population growth. And comes with that is the need to feed people, the need to move things around, the need for energy, the need for water. Now, a lot of these, when you look at things like ecological footprinting, go well beyond city and region areas. They extend much, much greater. So an implication for a decision made maybe in a city might affect an ecosystem service hundreds of kilometres away. So how do we look at this? And that might be a slow degrading over time. So we're looking at it in space, but also in time. So how do we deal with that? So there's some challenges for us, and I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.